Get back! You two, stop that!
That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
No. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
There's nothing to fear except God. Whatever that means to you.
Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?
You're listening to The Fear of God, a podcast exploring the intersection between Christianity and the horror genre.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Fear of God, a podcast discussing that strange but surprisingly compelling intersection between the Christian faith and the horror genre. With you, as always, is myself, co-host Nathan Rouse. You know, typically, with me is dear friend and compatriot and co-host Reed Lackey, but I mean, we were talking earlier and he got a call from somebody named Black Phillip, and I haven't heard from him in a while, so I don't know. I mean, that's a strange name for someone. He's never, Reed! Here you are. You're back. And
I am with thee.
Oh no. What has happened to you? Just kidding. Welcome, my friend, to your podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, my friend. Welcome to you as well. Same.
Yeah. Today we're going to be discussing the frighteningly frightening and scary and very scary movie. If I haven't mentioned, it's a very scary movie. Called The Witch, subtitled A New England Folktale. Before we get there, Reed, before, the shivers go up the spine, how you doing? Any new,
Doing well.
We haven't done this in a couple of weeks, but any movies or anything striking your radar that's been of particular interest or note lately?
No, sadly not. My home and family and work life has been very, very busy. So I actually have not been able to watch much that wasn't directly related to the podcast. Although, and podcast listeners are not going to care at all about this, particularly in an episode about The Witch, but, something that I did sort of engage with, that listeners are going to laugh at. Have you ever seen, the Barbershop movies?
I think I saw the first one, and found it entertaining enough.
It's funny. I have a special place in my heart for those movies. I had just recently got the third one, and basically the reason that I wanted to catch up with them, I had seen.
Wow.
Yeah.
You are a fan.
Well, the first one, I watched like a really long time ago and only re-engaged with because the third one came out and was very highly praised, very highly reviewed. And so just, because you asked, we don't have to spend a ton of time on it, but I like those movies. They're fun. They're good. And they have a good finger on the pulse of the importance of community, which of course I respond to very strongly. So yeah, I enjoy those films. That's about the only thing that wasn't directly related to the podcast that I've watched in recent weeks.
Well, indeed, Reed, that is I'm hesitant to use the word surprising because you are a man of many tastes, and so I won't necessarily call that surprising. It is unexpected, but I can get down with the Barbershop. I did watch, this will date a little bit of when we're recording this. The only other thing that I've seen non-podcast wise, hey, you know what? I did watch, we referenced this in Gremlins. I did rewatch Children of Men, and
Oh, good.
it is not, in fact, rooted to any specific time frame, so we can rest easy knowing that information.
Gotcha.
I did also go see Rogue One in the theater, and
I have yet to, so be careful.
Yeah.
Careful, you. No, I'm just kidding. And listeners are going to hear this in mid-January and be like, he still hasn't seen Rogue One? I will likely have seen Rogue One by the time you hear this. I just haven't by the time we've recorded this.
I can't remember. Are you traditionally like a fan? I mean, I know you've got a deep love for Star Trek. Are you traditionally just kind of a more casual fan of Star Wars, or do you have a deep sort of affection for that too?
I would call myself a slightly above casual Star Wars fan. I am not deeply entrenched in it. I don't watch the movies over and over and over again like I do with the Star Trek universe. I have seen them all. I enjoy most of them, particularly, the original trilogy. I have a tremendous amount of affection for. Both Empire Strikes Back and A New Hope made my recently uploaded top 250 favorite films list. But yeah, I do enjoy them a lot, but I am not a rabid Star Wars fan. I enjoy it a lot, and I do not, compared to people who significantly enjoy it. Yeah, I would be very far down that list or that radar.
Well, Rogue One is a lot of fun. The latter half of the movie is particularly strong. Sometimes it feels the opposite with some of these tentpole features that the opening can be really strong and the back part not stick the landing. I feel like they've sort of inverted that a little bit.
Gotcha.
Regardless, I'll spare you the spoilers of everyone in the galaxy dying or anything like that.
Wow. See, there you go.
Or aliens, showing up, which actually could work in Star Wars world.
Well, it's Star Wars. Aliens are going to show up somewhere. Like everybody's basically an alien. There's no Earth.
But I was going to say, in that universe, are there aliens? It's just like everybody is a stranger. We can't prolong this any longer. We need to leave the refuge of our
barbershop.
No, well, yeah, sure, of our barbershop that's located in a little village, a tiny township in New England. We need to leave. We need to depart it and go to the edge of the forest and just sort of dive into this movie.
Oh man,
I've seen this twice now. I finally, back about 6 months ago, took the plunge. My kind of 19-year-old, I think he is, nephew was in town and is into this kind of stuff. And we watched it and both scared to death of it. But it's affecting. You can't come away with The Witch not at least having some sort of effect on you, for good or bad. And rewatched it. I think I texted you, and maybe I should post it on the Fear of God Facebook page, but I watched it recently with my sister and her husband, and that signature scene that happens about 7 minutes in, I look over and they're both kind of cowering behind their respective jackets and blankets. Rightfully so. That's dreadful and terrifying. How many times have you seen The Witch now?
Watching for this podcast was my third, which, given the fact that it came out this year, yes, I've seen the same movie 3 times in a given year. But yeah, it's my third time. I had the opportunity to have 2 conversations about it prior to this one. Some of that information, if listeners heard me on there, is going to be repeated. Which I didn't. You know what? Forgive me for this brief pause. I reluctantly did not give a shout out to the Geek Orthodox podcast last week during our Let Me In conversation. I want to apologize to them for that and shout out to them for that, because they had me on to talk about that movie as well. I just wanted to briefly aside there. But I had the opportunity to talk about The Witch on More Than One Lesson with Tyler last October. And then also in October was invited to Real World Theology to have a conversation about The Witch. Some of the thoughts are going to carry over, but this film is so rich in substance and theme that it's entirely possible that we'll say all new things, because there is a lot going on in this movie. And I feel that way every time I rewatch it, that there's something else to focus in on. There's something else to glean from it. It's a really impressive film. And it's interesting that you say, it's impossible to walk away unaffected, because, to hear IMDb comments, which I try to give them as little credibility as possible, but a lot of users didn't like this film. A lot of users, feel like this film is boring. I don't think they really understand what the film is scratching at or trying to accomplish. I find the film to be terrifying and powerful, and I find the film to be really, really effective and really strong. I have a tremendous amount of respect for it, more respect every single time I watch it. So it always surprises me.
You just made me think of Beetlejuice, and it keeps getting funnier every single time I see it.
Oh, that's awesome. That's fantastic. But it's true that this film just sort of grows in my esteem every time I encounter it. And so I always just find it a bit puzzling. Yes, it is slow paced. It's deliberately paced. I don't ever find it boring. I didn't find it boring my first viewing. I will acknowledge that because the language is so old, it would be difficult, perhaps without subtitles or without having seen the film already, to understand fully what's being said or what's going on in a given moment. I think that's to the film's credit because the film, unlike most films that I've seen, I am never taken out of this movie for a single frame. There's not a moment where I don't feel like I'm there with these people in the early 1600s. And that is a profound achievement in my book, particularly with modern sensibilities, with modern effects. This is the type of film that just really is a real, I'm going to use this word deliberately. I think it's a real treasure in that it is very specific and it's very focused. And I think, as a result, very rewarding.
Yes. I would echo much of what you just said. Let's do, not to dismiss any of our content, but to get to some meat. Let's be a little, speed round with likes, dislikes, and scary scenes. Just because I feel like there's some stuff to talk about that isn't even necessarily associated with theme, although they may entwine, and it's hard to address that without getting through some of this, earlier stuff. So, for me, I've got two easy ones, one like, one dislike. The like is just the big word verisimilitude. Like the period recreation of this film is, at least in aesthetic, like I'm no historian. That should be that's our tagline for this year. I'm no historian. It's okay. I've made bigger jumps than this. So I'm no historian, so I can't necessarily speak to every facet of the historicity and the recreation, all that sort of stuff. But purely for the effect of the film, they nail the mood, the tone, the atmosphere, that sense, that's the language as you described, that sense in which we are watching something from another time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I feel like it is hard for me to not just, and like you said, like if you wanted to catch every turn of phrase in this movie, it'd be hard to do without subtitles. But part of that is what sweeps you up in the effect as well.
Exactly.
These are not, the mother and the father are recognizable in that they show up here and there, in character parts, but largely this is a pretty unknown cast. To its credit. You talk about pulling you out of a movie. Like if Tom Cruise shows up in The Witch, we're like, oh, well, he's going to be okay. It's just a totally different experience. So that was a big one for me. Any likes specifically that you want to address?
I'll mention two, and they're performance based. I don't want to do it. I like all of the performances in this film, but the two likes, for the sake of some brevity, are just the full-bodied nature of William's character. The father could have easily been a stereotype, a caricature, a easily written off footnote in terms of, oh, he's the religious zealot who causes problems for everybody. But the film really works hard to make him a full-bodied and believable character. Some of that is in the actor's performance. He's played by Ralph Ineson. But I think that just in general, that performance is really strong. And holy cow, Caleb, the older boy.
Yeah, he's amazing.
He is outstanding in his performance. I don't even know where this kid came from. Like he's just so impressive.
I kind of don't want to know how they got his death scene performance out of him. Like,
yeah,
that's.
I haven't heard any rumors or anything of like bad happenings on the set. Everybody seemed to imply that it was a very warm set, but man, it is terrifying. And you know what's impressive about the scene? I said this in the More Than One Lesson conversation. What's impressive to me about that scene is that he's the one driving it. He's not feeding off of everybody.
Sure. Oh yeah,
he's
it's all him.
He's the one propelling that scene, and he's such a young actor and already so capable. He's somebody, Harvey Scrimshaw is his name, and he's somebody I think we should watch because he's got the potential to really do some incredible things in his career depending on the choices he makes after this. But I think he's really impressive. William's really impressive, and just I already mentioned the overall tone and authenticity of the film, as you spoke to as well, is something that really struck me as a big like. I actually have no dislikes. I officially, 3 viewings in, there's nothing about this film I don't like.
Well, it's funny. The only dislike I had, suddenly you saying that made me want to tag something onto it. All I have written down is Jonas and Mercy are the worst. The twins. And we'll get into this. I do have a slight dislike, and that's a bit of plotting confusion on my part as a viewer. And actually, I did a little research. It's not just my part, of exactly what happens to Jonas and Mercy at the end of the movie, but I'm sure we'll get there. I strangely feel compelled in a way we don't usually with these podcasts to say to listeners, this is one of few movies I would understand if folks kind of wanted to steer clear of, not because I don't think it's valuable, but it is fraught and it is heavy and it will, in the way we talked about with Let Me In, it kind of forces you to self-assess a little bit. This movie really, you could come away troubled and I far be it for us to encourage people feeling troubled, but I do want to, in ways we rarely do, say, if you just want to listen to this podcast and hear us talk about it, I sort of would understand that, because it's a pretty freaking heavy movie.
It really is. Well, and it's worth noting, since you mentioned that, that there was some controversy in Christian circles around the witch, because early in its marketing it was endorsed by the Satanic Temple, and something that I think it's worth noting, that the Satanic Temple has also endorsed Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. They've endorsed Fantasia. They've endorsed Night of the Hunter, which is one of my very favorite films. And so it was something where I don't think that just an endorsement by that organization is automatically means that Christians can't find some substance in here. And also, when we get into theme, it's something that I find a little puzzling, given kind of the reason that they seem to have endorsed it, but we'll save that for later. But I do understand and echo and agree. This is the kind of film that I would understand if people were like, I don't really want to see this movie. I just want to sort of know about it, or that's fine. I do think that it's a film that is worth seeing if you have the sort of stamina, the constitution, if you will, to be able to handle the content and what this film is talking about. We talked last week about cautionary tales, and this is firmly, for me, in that category, that this is a cautionary tale through and through. It is bleak as the day is long and the night is sharp. It is a bleak film in structure, in tone, in narrative, bleak all the way through. And so, yeah, I definitely agree. It's something that I would understand if people were like, maybe I skipped that one.
Well, in
maybe
fact, it's funny you talk about its bleakness. Watching it with my sibling and her husband, Kate and Richard, shout out, at about a third of the way through, this is after the baby is lost. This is after a couple of other incidents have occurred. My sister said, it's so hard for them. And I was like, we're not even there yet. I mean, like, just, this is like, speaking of, some scary things, let's dive into some of that. I think that 7 minutes in, the fate of Samuel is almost, I texted you the first time I saw this. That is a moment where if you have tempted to watch this movie, you would probably turn it off. And I wouldn't blame you. Yeah. I do think the only thing for me personally that sort of saves it is, as this movie is throughout, it is so artful. It is so, I hesitate, I understand my use of this word in context here. It's so classy. It is artfully rendered, the death of this baby, which just saying that sentence out loud sounds horrific and is horrific, but the way it happens, I would understand if someone turned this movie off at that point. Wouldn't you agree?
Sure. Oh, no, completely. I've mentioned before on the podcast that I'm very protective of what my wife sees. She tries to engage with as much, just mostly to show some support for the show and everything. She'll try to engage with as much of this as possible and support for me. But this is one that I didn't even question. I was like, you can't watch this film. 7 minutes in, you'll be like, like, we can't, like, this is not going to continue. And again, like you said, if they had shown anything else, I mean, they show enough. But if they had shown anything else about what happens to poor Samuel, I think I'd have been out. I think I'd have been like, this can't. It's just one of those things where I feel like Tyler on the More Than One Lesson show said Robert Eggers is not only a savvy filmmaker, but he's a sensitive one.
Yeah, that's a good word.
And I think he already has a good instinct, for exactly how much his audience is going to be able to tolerate before they're going to bow out on him.
Because in that scene, Reed, you have this feeling in you like, I am readying to turn this off.
Yeah.
And then you're like,
remote in my hand.
Then you're like, well, okay. It's a strange feeling.
I totally agree.
Sensitive is a good word. I like that.
That's a scary moment for me, obviously, is Samuel's death. Another scary moment for me is Mom's dream near the end of the movie, and that freaking
Mom in general. Come on.
Yeah. Mom's pretty freaky. Mom is really unsettling and unnerving.
She's kind of lost it before the movie starts.
But also one thing that I'll say about the film, more so than like scary moments, is I feel like the entire film is just fraught with tension.
Oh yeah.
Never ease.
Nope.
In this film, there's never a relenting moment. Like there's one 30-second scene where she and Caleb are talking about the glass back in England, and that's like, maybe everything's okay in those 30 seconds. And other than that, the whole movie is like, oh my God, something's about to happen. Oh my Lord. No,
because
don't look around.
In a fascinating way, many scary movies, I think, and this is definitely a generalization, I understand that, but there are external things happening to a group of characters or a character, and those external things may persist until this character is passing in some possibly violent way. What's fascinating about The Witch is the external elements are directly responsible for internal strife. Right. And that's to your point about never feeling at ease, because everything that happens outside of them affects what happens in their four walls.
Exactly.
And just, it's like you put a pot of water on the stove and just set it to hot. Right. The longer it sits there, the more it's going to start boiling until it's just completely over. You mentioned Caleb's death, which my note said would be beautiful if it wasn't so horrifying.
Right.
And then two just sort of drive-by scary moments is the witch milking the goat and the mom nursing the crow. Those were awful.
Whoa. Listeners, just take those statements in.
Exactly.
And that's what you're in for with this movie.
Right. So let's talk about this movie. So listeners won't know this, but Reed, you and I had a healthy hour-long back and forth via text the other day after I'd seen it a second time, just trying to sort through. And I made up a new song about Black Phillip, who's really has a double life as a pirate on the high seas and is sort of like a modern day chicken boo.
Sung to the tune of Gilligan's Island, lest we forget. Chicken boo.
Black Phillip. He wears a disguise to look like human guys, but he's not a man. He's a chicken boo.
Oh my God.
Welcome to 2017, everybody. So there's a lot happening in this movie. So mine and your conversation via text was all about what did or didn't happen to Jonas and Mercy, and how comfortable we are with or without the ambiguity. You're very comfortable with it. It bothered me, not on a spiritual level, on a I feel like the movie answers a lot of different things and somehow doesn't directly answer that one. But we can get into that if we want to. But mainly, I'm interested in a conversation about the reality/unreality happening on film. And I got a little disheartened. I didn't text you about this as a follow-up because I figured we'd get into it. So I did some digging after our big conversation because I'm like, certainly we are not the only ones having this conversation. So I did some Googling. But I need to preface that by saying after my first viewing and being deeply unsettled by the movie, wherein I took pretty much everything on screen as literally happening, you made the comment that gave me hope for my own spiritual sanity and well-being that perhaps to caveat my preface, the movie is about this family being utterly tormented to the point of insanity and death by a witch.
Right.
And you learn that at the end of the movie, a goat that's been present with them the whole movie named Black Phillip, may or may not be the actual devil.
Yeah.
But the scene that immediately precedes this revelation is Thomasin, the girl who is our point of view character, having endured and witnessed and then a certain way perpetrated the death of her entire family, she falls asleep.
Yeah.
And so you made the point after my first viewing, like, well, is it possible she's asleep for that final scene with Black Phillip? And that gave me so much hope. Like, please let that be true, because this movie is just messing me up. Because it is fascinating. Again, we're backdooring some themes here, but there is nothing literally on screen during Caleb's death, which is this beautiful, the script has him enraptured in the presence of Jesus. And it's this actual really lovely, like I said, beautiful, if not horrifying scene of his passing. But there's physically nothing on screen with him. Whereas at the end, she is present with this actual physical entity that is the human form of Black Phillip revealed.
Right, right.
So that's a long preface for opening up this conversation of what is and isn't happening on screen. And so I'm curious from you, Reed, like, so this digging I did and what made me sort of happy about that interpretation is I don't love stories where not just the bad guys win, but the friggin', I mean, if you want to use the word win, the devil wins, and sort of claims this victim. So there's a couple of questions here. One, is the witch of the title Thomason, or is it this other physical entity in the forest tormenting them? So that's one question. Question two is, if we take the final scene as literal, then to use witch language, there's a coven of witches. There's a group.
Right.
So are we meant to think there's only been one witch tormenting the whole time, or are there more than one? But what will be revelatory to our conversation about the fate of Jonas and Mercy, and what dispels what I want to be the case that this is a dream state at the end. Again, this is all interpretive, and I understand that. But many people are speculating that the witch that has been present throughout the movie, yes, does whisk them away in the night, but that they are fodder for the fire in the forest that the witches are dancing around.
Oh my good Lord, are you serious? That's horrifying.
Yeah, that is sort of the common going theory that is present, which, again, if is true, makes this a literal encounter at the end and not a dream state. You know what I mean?
And all the more frightening because of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So again, I know that's not directly addressing themes. It is just trying to gain some clarity, figure out what do we actually think is happening in this movie. Is it okay? I think it's totally okay with ambiguity.
Right.
I just don't want there to be ambiguity where there might not be intended to be ambiguity.
Sure. Well, I will say this, like, and this is going to sound more dismissive than I intended to. Like, for me, I find it interesting and enjoy to a degree the fact that we don't quite know the fate of Jonas and Mercy. We talked at length about that. I will say though that, like, and this would be true for almost every scene of this film. Somebody comes to me and they say, "Hey, I think this is what's happening." Honestly, in most cases, depending on the theories, I would probably say, you know what, you could read it that way. You could look at it that way, because this film is so open to different interpretations. And I think that's to the film's credit, because I think it rewards reviewing, it rewards discussion, it rewards being able to sort of examine it on a deeper level. And so if somebody comes to me and is like, like the moment you said that, like Jonas and Mercy are in the fire at the end, you know, I got chills all over again. And I'm like, good Lord, that is horrific and awful and entirely possible.
And makes perfect sense.
It makes perfect sense and is entirely possible. To directly answer your questions, I think I would say that while, so if somebody were to say, hey, Thomason is the witch of the title, what I would want to clarify, I do not agree with a reading of the film that she was, which I have heard, that she was a witch the whole time.
Correct. I would agree with that.
I think that
I would agree with your disagreement.
Yeah, I got it. That, like, she, I think, doesn't become one until the end, although you could make a case that the film is about her, and that at the end she ends as a witch. That's clear. So, so that is, that's one thing. So, or you could say that it was referring to, the threat that came into this family, or the looming threat of witchcraft. I would also say, in regard to, are there more than one tormenting them? It's the first, this moment is the first moment that I'm thinking about it, but I'm actually not bothered by that. I actually think it's possible to say, like, hey, they have three different, sort of witch encounters, the first being who takes Samuel, the second being, who bewitches Caleb, and the third being who confronts Jonas and Mercy in the barn. If those were all three different witches, like that's fine, because the film shows us that there's a coven of witches in the end. So I think it's a valid reading.
Well, and I do think, to me, probably the most valid reading of those two things. I'm comfortable, like you said, with the duality of the title. Like, is the witch referring to an external threat? Yes. Is the witch possibly referring to Thomason by movie's end? Sure. I don't think personally there's a ton of support for there being multiple witches tormenting them. It's only if we take the ending as literal that it would sort of beg that question. Like, well, it does kind of make sense that there's many of them around this fire at the end. Does that then mean we might not have just been witnessing one? Regardless, I think that's more the witch thing feels like an interpretive choice. The multiple witches things feels like a speculative choice that doesn't have a whole lot of fruit.
Right.
But to clue listeners in, I mean, what spawned mine and yours text back and forth was I was struggling with the lack of clarity about Jonas and Mercy, simply because I feel like the script is very intentional about, it's not intentional about, not leaving some mystery in. It does feel intentional about clarity of a person being living or dead based on certain things that happen in the plot of the film. So anyway, I felt like that was a worthwhile conversation to have, just to sort of flesh out, okay, now we can sort of engage some thematic stuff that we've got a root in. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, it certainly does. And I'll sort of piggyback on that and run with it, because the main thing, part of me when I was preparing for this episode was genuinely, this is the first time that you and I are talking about this in a substantive way, but it is the third time that I've had the opportunity to discuss this film in this type of format. And I wanted to hone in on something a little different, or that I hadn't talked about yet. And one of the things that I think is all through this film, both in the narrative, in the characters, and in the audience that's viewing it, is the conflict between certainty and uncertainty. That, in a sense, we are very confident of certain things, certain elements in our life, things that we feel we can control, things that we feel we have a handle on, things that we can take as assurance. I will wake up tomorrow, the sun will rise. It might be a foggy or a cloudy day, but the sun will come up. It's going to happen. And then all the other elements in our life that are uncertain. When conflict comes into our life, am I going to be okay? When trouble imperils us, like, am I going to make it through this? And I think this film is really playing in almost every frame. We could probably do a scene-by-scene commentary in this film, if we really wanted to. But I think almost everything is playing on this notion of certainty versus uncertainty. Like, look at the character of William. When we first meet him, he is so confident and so certain of his beliefs and his theology that the Puritans are kicking him out of the plantation.
Right. And it's not because he's sinned and gotten it wrong. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like ostracism due to negative behavior. It's like, gosh, you Puritans are wrong. We gotta go.
It's like,
you aren't living up.
Oh my gosh. It's like somebody looking at Jerry Falwell and being like, you're a little liberal. Like, I mean, it's and I say that with no judgment. I'm just like, that's the level of extreme. It's like these Puritans are kicking him out for his religious zealotry. So that's something that what does he say when he leaves? He looks at them in pride and says, how sadly hath the Lord judged you. And then he leaves, but then what begins to happen to his family? He's so certain and confident that he kisses the ground when he sees where they're gonna, see the plantation. And then as the film progresses, certainty becomes less and less a commodity that this family can depend on. Not only certainty of, are we going to be okay, but what is really happening? What's really taking place? Who can we trust? What can we trust? Can we trust even our own senses in this thing? And it all starts with the death of Samuel. Because then, when William and Caleb are out in the woods talking about it, what does William say to Caleb? He says, I can't tell you where Samuel is. I can't tell you where we're going to go, who we're going to be. I can tell you, this sort of hope of truth or whatever, but we really don't know. And so, for a man who was so stubborn in his faith and theology that he got kicked out of a Puritan plantation, then to have this moment of, I'm not even sure where my son is, who has died.
Well, and what's so fascinating about this movie, and I don't know anything about the screenwriter or the director, but this movie is a very real litmus test of your own personal theology.
Yeah. I agree.
Like I can watch this movie and feel like I do think this movie is an indictment of a certain brand of Christian living and Christian interpretation. And I can feel very comfortable with that indictment because it sounds harsher than I mean it, but because I would sort of indict it myself. But I think what's important and is again, the text, the content, how they handle or don't the pressures that are assaulting them reveals a lot about what you think of the world and God.
Yeah.
Because for me, like there's a line I wrote down, that scene you're referring to with Caleb and the father in the forest, where he's getting Caleb to recite all these whatevers.
Yeah.
And Caleb says, "My corrupt nature is empty of grace." And I thought, good Lord, you guys, that's it right there. And again, like it is not meant for us in the span of 45 minutes, 50 minutes talking about a movie that is The Witch to be able to completely unpack some of the theology here. But there is treasures to be discussed and dissected from this text. Right. And I personally am more of a sort of more traditional view, saint and sinner kind of thing. But I would even take it a step further. Like I don't feel like we are born of death and find life. I feel like we began in the garden, which is a place of beauty and goodness and belonging. We do depart that garden for something less than, and life is about an attempt to return, not to that garden, but to bounty, to plenty, to goodness, faithfulness, and love and compassion. So what much of, I believe, Puritan theology, at least as it's expressed in this movie, is about is not we find our origin in the garden and are trying to return to a place of home, as much as it is we are born in the wilderness of death, and by some stroke of God's good fortune, we might enter into life. Yeah. That's what it feels like. And so when this child, I mean, it is, as a parent, it is eminently heartbreaking. Oh, yeah. Says, "My corrupt nature is empty of grace." I want to hug that child and say, "No, my son. Right. You, by essence of Imago Dei, the image of God, you have something of this in you. Let's nurture that into fruition and flower and growth." And so it's like, they get it. To me, people may watch this movie and think, "Oh God, the devil's assaulting the Christians." Like that's as you've said, that's a certain interpretation, and it's not a sort of an incorrect interpretation on a certain level. Right. But I would say your pathology of your faith, a pathology I learned in a very definition way recently, is just that, it's the abuse of a behavior behavior that in your life is intended to be benign becomes monstrous in your life. Yeah. Like they have pathologized religion. Yeah. You know what I mean? And so again, this is a question of, if this interpretive at the end, is there simply a witch and the devil? Is it just the witch? So whatever. Whoever is preying on them, be it both and, or just one, is manipulating this pathology. Yeah. I would not say the witch or devil is using their faithfulness against them. I don't think that is true. Right. I think it is using their abuse, their pathology, their skewed interpretation of God and living with him against them to their death. I agree with that wholeheartedly. I have a couple of quick thoughts. Speaking to what you said earlier about, my corrupt nature is absent of grace. If I can't remember if I'm saying that quote right or not, but a couple of things that I wrote down. One thing is that when the father dies, his final words are, "Corruption, thou art my father." Like he again talks about corruption. And it's heartbreaking when he, the night before everything sort of finally dissolves, the night before everything finally unravels, he is out there, pouring the dirt that he kissed out of affection because he thought it was his hope. He's pouring that dirt into his mouth. And this line stands out to me so much. Just and huge kudos to the actor who delivers it so powerfully. "I beg thee, my Christ, I have not damned my family." He just, just pleading, "Please God, do not let it be true that I have lost us, that I have basically undone us." And you talk about this pathology, you talk about, these sort of touch points of manipulation. Two things that I thought that I'll express very quickly.
there's something of an undercurrent of the theme of traps in the film. Like they're constantly laying traps for animals in the woods. And I had mentioned on the Real World Theology podcast that I kind of see the witch as kind of trapping them. I view the whole thing as like, like when they encamped in that specific place, they had no clue at that moment that they were literally at the edge of the spider's web, and that it was just a matter of time before they get stuck in it. And then the spider comes, wraps them up, quite literally consumes them. Well, in the case of Samuel, quite literally consumes them. And then in this other case, just unravels them and undoes them. So there's this theme of traps. And one thing that it made me think about is, I don't think we've ever said this explicitly on the show, but there's a profound difference between substantial faith and deeply entrenched superstition. There's a profound difference between those two. And I feel like a lot of times people will express what they feel is devotion or what they consider to be devotion. And I'll listen to it and I'll hear it, and immediately something will flag in my mind where I'm like, that is superstition. That's something that you are operating in. I got to make sure I don't walk under the ladder. I don't break the mirror, or I'll get 7 years of bad luck. And they'll operate in their level of faith. Like, I got to make sure I don't do this, or this other thing will happen. Or if I don't commit this sin, then this other thing won't happen. And then they get frustrated. It sometimes happens. I'll tell you, the most prominent place where it takes place is in the area of tithe. A lot of people will say, like, oh, I have to tithe so my finances are protected. And I'm not trying to derail us into a side conversation about that. I'm simply saying that it is possible to be just basically treat your faith as if it is something that you can control. Treat your faith as if it is something that you can manipulate. And I think that's the difference between substantial faith and superstition. Is faith surrenders and releases control. Superstition has to control. Like, look at the character of William, and he basically only does what he can control. Like it says, Thomason says when she finally like sort of goes off on him, Thomason says, "Thou canst do nothing save cut wood." You can't do anything except for chop wood. And it's only what he can control that he tries to do. And what does he try to do whenever he encounters anything that threatens his family or threatens his faith? He tries to overpower it with the strength of his intellect or the force of his will. He tries to control it again. Jonas and Mercy, when they have their moment where they sort of are bewitched and they pass out, what does he do? He yanks them up and starts shaking them, tries to shake them, rattle them out of it. That's his only response to anything that goes wrong. He does not really reach out to the Lord in relationship. He doesn't reach out to the Lord from a substance of faith. He's depending on what he feels that he knows to be true, what he feels to be something that he can control. That's all that he has to lean on. And I think there's some substantial things that the film has to say about the differences between faith and superstition, because superstition is something that you control and you manipulate. And what does the witch do? She preys on their superstitions. She preys on their sort of flaws and their doubt and their uncertainty, and she uses that to manipulate them to the point of unraveling. Does all that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that as we this just came to me, and it's really interesting that these two movies were so in close proximity to each other, but let me in.
Right.
It's interesting. Your heart breaks for Thomason.
Absolutely.
And sort of akin to Owen in Let Me In, my God, the child is just looking for some compassion, some understanding, some love.
Right.
It's just this family. It's not like she has peers she can go play with.
Oh, yeah. They have nobody. Right.
Her only peer is Caleb, and they seem to have a good friendship, except that now he's turning into a young man and is noticing more than he should, and that's making things weird for him. And that's a whole other interesting conversation about the sexuality and how much they talk about sending her away. Like, it is amazing. Again, I'm okay with the indictment this movie makes of this brand of faith, because I don't find it to be, this is going to sound strong, because I don't find it to be faithful. I find it to be rooted exclusively in fear.
I agree. No, I completely agree.
And I don't mean to be dismissive or indicting of the people that are occupying this movie. I mean to say that fear of everything is not faith in anything. Somebody tweet that. Goodness gracious.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I mean, that's exactly what's operating here. They're afraid of everything. Mm-hmm. They're afraid of getting everything wrong. They're afraid of their own daughter for being what? A normal freaking human woman. Right. They are afraid of her. And they're afraid of each other. They're afraid of God. And hear me, like the name of our stinking podcast is The Fear of God. But I feel like if you go back and listen to our pilot, we're pretty express about what we mean by that. It isn't you are to live in dread fear for your very soul in the face of Yahweh himself. Right. It is to say there's a healthy reverence associated with proper relationship with God. Right. Not what these characters are displaying and living out. You know, like, bless her heart, that poor mother, before she's completely gone, she doesn't get to have her space for her grief, because the longer she's in her grief over Samuel, the more it impedes the family's ability to come together.
Exactly.
Provoking the father to lie to her about the cup. Like, all of this, you talk about them being on the edge of the spider web. They are weaving their own. Yeah. Right inside that house. And the witch just comes along once they're all entrapped in their own devices and finishes them off. You know, I don't know. It's fascinating to see that correlation between this Thomason in this movie and Owen in that movie, but based on things like human sexuality, based on things like inattentiveness by authority figures in their life. You know, I mean, I don't know. It's really powerful.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I think another element that doesn't directly link the two films, but perhaps links our conversations about them. One of the situations we talked a little bit when we discussed Let Me In, talking about how when we say don't give the devil a foothold, part of that is our responsibility as a community of believers as well as it is as individual believers.
Yep.
So, and what have they done? They've been kicked out of the plantation, so they are utterly isolated. They are utterly cut off from any sense of community. And I want to say this, I deeply believe in the necessity of community for a variety of reasons. And I've said things like this before. I've said things like this on this show before, that when you separate yourself from a community of faith, then what tends to happen is now you no longer have any challenge to your beliefs. You no longer have anything like they believe a lot of things that are incorrect, and that are, even if they're not necessarily incorrect, that are not helpful towards whole and healthy living. And if they were in a community of believers, they might be around people who would challenge that, and who might speak some grace into that, speak some hope, speak some wholeness into that, but they're on their own. So they're stuck in their own head. And then you get into situations like there's no encouragement for when they feel despair. There's no help for their trouble. There's nothing for them because they are utterly alone. They're utterly isolated. There's two passages of scripture that I thought about in terms of this isolation. Is the first one is Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 1, which simply says, statement of fact, one who has isolated himself seeks his own desires and rejects all sound judgment. And that's something that that's a condition that they've found themselves in. The other one is Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 through 10, where it says simply, two people are better than one, for they can help each other succeed. If one person falls, the other can reach out and help, but someone who falls alone is in real trouble. And I thought when I came across that passage, just that phrase, someone who falls alone is in real trouble. And I was like, that is the witch summed up. Like that's the narrative of this film, is that when you are isolated and alone and cut off from a source of community and from a source of health and wholeness, cut off from the body, if you will, then all you have is your own resources, your own understandings, your own sort of tools in your toolbox. And if you're somebody who probably is operating more out of superstition than out of faith, you're going to be easy fodder for any prey or predator that wants to come and manipulate that, and any sort of dark force, any sort of life happening that comes. And it's a house of cards. It's going to utterly fall apart as it does for these people. It utterly unravels.
Well, and what's fascinating to consider, as we, kind of perhaps steer towards home. Visually, topographically, a strange word, but feel where I'm going here. We wouldn't associate this with what we're seeing on the screen in the movie The Witch with this family, but in a literal sense, they might as well be in a desert. Like this family has nothing. Yeah. They are starving. I think what I'm trying to illustrate here is it's one thing when you have a particular need, but all of your other needs are being met. You know what I mean? Like, that's life. Like, okay, good. The bills are paid. Well, now I can give attention to this thing. Okay, well, the kids are fed, so now I can give attention to this need. Right. You know what I mean? Like, that's how life goes. It's a whole other ball game when the bills aren't paid. Yep. The kids aren't fed. No food is coming in. No money's coming in. We barely have a roof over our heads. We're all stuck in one room. The kid just died. Oh, you know what I mean? Like, entirely. These people were already struggling with their sanity. Like, that is a recipe for, I mean, your illustration of House of Cards is perfect. Like, they were primed for destruction. I mean, really, and on top of all of that, you have a personal, pathological, we might say religion, we might say philosophy view of the world that says all of this is some form of punishment already from God, or all of this, I still have to do another thing to make sure I break this cycle and God loves me and is going to reward us. Man, what a mess for these people. I don't know. I think that to your point, like you just have to have someone healthy in your life somewhere. You do. Yeah. And you have to have that. And you also have, and this is what they lacked as well, the self-awareness to know you are drowning. Yeah. Because what they viewed as God's maybe torture or punishment or rebuke was just drowning. Yeah. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't self-aware. It was pathological. It was narrow. It was legalism. Right. Yeah, it really was. To kind of keep coming back to that. Yeah. It was them having bought into the lie that Caleb says, which is our corrupt nature is empty of grace. Thus, when your child looks at you and says, what happened to that 3-month-old who was taken from us? And you can say, I don't know. You are in deep trouble. Yes. Yeah. Because we can split hairs all day long about age of accountability and yada, yada, yada. But when you're in that moment, and as a faithful believer might be able to say, I don't know what happened to that person's soul or spirit or what have you, like, you got some problems. Yeah. Well, and I'll say too, possibly as a final note from myself, and good Lord, listeners may hear that, we're kind of bouncing all over the place, and they may feel when we wrap up that like, oh wow, they only barely touched the surface. Well, that's the kind of film this is, because this is, like I said, we could do a scene by scene breakdown of this and still not tap into everything. But one of the things I think, sort of bouncing off of what you said, a presumption is usually made in life, and particularly in movies, that if a character expresses a faith that seems to be devout and they're not immediately written off as crazy, then the presumption is made that things are going to go well for them. That I'll say it this way, that all that is required is sort of getting right with God, what we would call getting right with God, and then everything is going to be okay. But what we know, or what I believe, is that there are so many other considerations which are also of the essence. Considerations of your emotional well-being, of your physical well-being, of your mental well-being, of your relational well-being. William may be a really great theologian, but he is a terrible husband and father. He has got an awful, and that's not to say that he doesn't love his family. He clearly deeply loves his family, but he doesn't know how to be that for them. He doesn't know how to do that. And maybe if in a community of people, he would get some help in that regard, or get some assistance there. But they're so stuck in feeling like their faith is all that matters, that it's all they've got. And when it's not really as substantial as they believed it to be, you just have to give some considerations to these other areas of being whole. And, some people might find that a little scandalous, or may find it surprising that a devout Christian is saying getting right with God is not all there is to it. But I think whole living involves being attentive to every element and aspect of who you are as a person, and making sure that you're taking care of what needs to be taken care of in that regard, which they clearly don't. And when they don't, they are subject to the witch in the woods, as it were. Yep.
Well, we haven't even talked about that final scene. We haven't talked except briefly about Caleb's death scene, but there's just so much to talk about in this movie. I'm going to say, we're going to go ahead and end it if that's okay with you. Hey everyone. So, this is something that we haven't done yet on the show before. We are tagging in without the usual introduction and fanfare because basically when Nathan and I, by the way, hi Nathan.
Good morning, Reed. You know what? I'm already going to stop you because I like fanfare just in general in life. And, let's do the parade. So go ahead. I'm here.
So the reason that we're giving you this little bonus episode is because when Nathan and I were discussing The Witch earlier this week, we really felt, I think I really felt, but Nathan agreed, after minor convincing, that the conversation really wasn't quite done about that film. As we'd said in the episode, you could really do a scene by scene commentary for the entire thing. But, we wanted to have a little bit of a bonus, a little bit of an added, mini episode, if you want to call it that. We're calling it a bonus episode, where we really do a deeper dive into the conversation about the ending of the movie The Witch. And so that's what this is. You can consider it, an appendix to the earlier conversation. You can consider it its own separate thing if you want to, where we just discuss this film's ending. But either way, that's what we're going to be concentrating on. We're not going to do the usual scary moments and likes, dislikes. We're just going to dive right into the themes and the structure and the substance of the ending of the film The Witch. So for those of you who may not have seen the film and chose not to see the film, but you did listen to it.
Why are you listening to this?
But if you did listen to our last episode and you thought like, hey, I'm going to skip that movie, but I'm interested to hear what they have to say about it or what their perspective is. So in brief, the elements of what we're talking about today, I'm going to summarize in maybe 2 minutes what the ending of that film is. So I'm going to fast forward through all of the major plot beats of the film, except that when Caleb, the oldest son in their household, died, there were some situations involving whether or not he was witched. They were uncertain because he vomited up an actual apple, which seemed supernatural. But then towards the end, right before he passed away, he seemed to have an experience where he had seen Jesus and seemed to express redemption. Well, then the paranoia increases, and that evening, William, the father, repents and begs God to show him that his family's not doomed. When they wake up the next morning, this is what we discussed on the last episode, that the two twins, Jonas and Mercy, are disappeared, nowhere to be seen. And then also all of their animals are slaughtered, with the specific deliberate exception of Black Phillip, their main black goat. Thomason is still alive. She's bewildered, but she's still alive. William wakes up, walks out, and is almost immediately killed by Black Phillip. Black Phillip gores him with one of his horns, and he's almost immediately killed. Following that, the mom, I believe her name is Kate.
Yes.
So the mom, immediately following that, begins to go crazy on Thomason and calls her a witch, begins to beat her, and Thomason, simply in self-defense, kills the mother, which is horrific in its own right. But the part that we specifically wanted to talk about is that immediately following that whole instance where Thomason kills her mother, she goes into the barn, she goes to sleep, and then we're paused and we skipped ahead to that evening. And that evening she goes back into the barn. She has a conversation with the goat where she tries to conjure the goat to speak to her, and the goat literally transforms into the devil. Now, there's no special effects or anything. It happens off camera, but the goat literally transforms into the devil.
Black Phillip, I conjure thee to speak to me. Dost thou understand my English tongue? Answer me.
What dost thou want?
What canst thou give?
basically makes Thomason sign his book. She wanders out naked into the woods, following this goat, and stumbles upon an entire coven of witches who then begin to float up in the air. They're dancing around a fire and chanting. They begin to float up into the air, and then Thomason herself begins to float up into the air, laughing maniacally. That is, cut to black. that is the summer feel-good ending of The Witch. I want to start, especially because I've been talking for a few minutes, by bouncing to Nathan. What was your initial sort of reaction to this ending in general?
At the first time I've seen it, again, as discussed on the primary episode, I've seen it twice now. The first time just to be frank, it scared the hell out of me. I will say before the thematic stuff gets addressed directly, I think that final scene in the barn, stable, whatever it is expertly rendered on screen. I mean, it is, I remember the first time I saw it when she verbally addresses Black Phillip in there and entreats him to speak to her. In my head, I thought, there is no chance we're about to watch a goat talk. Like this is not that movie. You know what I mean? Like we're not about to cut to the goat CGI talking to Tom. Like it's just, I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew we weren't going to get that. So I didn't know what was going to happen. Well, then she turns to leave and you hear that malevolent, almost whisper. It's like he went to the Jack Bauer School of Acting, Thomason, we'll come back, whatever. So she stays, and still I'm thinking there's no way we're about to see a talking goat. And then that Pirates of the Caribbean extra walks in behind her, which I say in a jokey manner, but at the same time, the way it's rendered on screen, there's nothing funny about it. I mean, it is terrifying. Right. And I don't know. I just think just visually it is captivating in as much as this whole thing is scary as hell. As far as, you and I mentioned this in part A, you had alluded to the possibility of her having fallen asleep when she goes back into the house, or rather clearly she falls asleep, but that everything post that scene is sort of a dream state. Right. And I think my spirit wants that to be true. I think the more I've read, I can't get away from the likelihood that Jonas and Mercy are the kindling on the fire. Or the kindling. Wow. Thinking that is probably the case, it stands to reason everything post her waking up is literally happening, spiritually, but is physically happening in time and space as opposed to a dream state, which, to be frank, does unnerve me a good bit. I mean, it is on its own an unnerving movie, but I do think, and you may be heading this direction, I don't know, but what does give me food for thought and things to consider are, I think, as seriously as we are meant to take that finale, and it is terrifying, I do think we're as equally seriously meant to take Caleb's death. I think those are meant to be kind of counterpoints to each other.
Yeah, exactly.
And so in a sense, while that isn't a hopeful interpretation, I don't feel like the movie is trying to say, this is the course of action you should take when whatever. Like, you know what I mean? Like I think they're trying to give as much as they can while still telling a scary story, trying to give equal weight to what is real in these people's worlds. Does that make sense at all?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I definitely agree with you that I believe, and I know for me, this was my interpretation of it, that Caleb's and Thomason's final moments that we see for them, Caleb's definite death and Thomason's sort of resignation to this coven of witches, are meant to be counterpoints. I couldn't agree more. I saw them as such. I found it interesting that in both instances, the characters seem kind of relieved of their burdens, kind of lighter.
Sure.
And, in the case of Thomason, almost literally lighter because she begins to float. But I do not see their ends as having come to the same place of peace or resolution.
Sure.
One of the things that I found interesting about this film, and I believe I mentioned this in our proper episode and never called back to it, was the fact that the Satanic Temple endorsed this film. And I found that puzzling. At first I had found, before I had seen the film, I found that troubling, and it caused me to have some caution as to whether or not I even wanted to see the film. But then after having seen the film, I found it puzzling. I think from what I've read that the endorsement was largely because of sort of the liberation of the shackles of religious oppression against women. And there's certainly a large degree of exploration of that in the narrative of the film. But why I found it puzzling, and I said this on the More Than One Lesson episode. I can't remember if I said it on the Real World Theology episode, but it was puzzling to me because Thomason is really not free at the end. She is, you could have a reading of this film where like, hey, she was under the thumb of this puritanical religious thought and now she's been released from that. But how? By signing her name and pledging her allegiance to the devil, who is in this film yet another man?
Or is he a goat?
Or is he a goat?
Is he a goat man?
That's, but like,
that makes me think of, I know you don't even care or want to have this. There was a Saturday Night Live character. Jim Brewer. Do you remember this guy?
Oh, yes.
I mean, to be frank, I actually dislike him on a deep level, but he had this stupid, idiotic goat man character. And see, now we're completely rewriting the end of The Witch to include Jim Brewer as the goat man.
It'd be Jim Brewer.
Anyway.
That's funny. Well, I mean, like that was something that I, sort of scratched my head a little bit when I was trying to figure out and understand exactly why they would so champion this film. And I'll say this is one of the main things that I wanted to sort of address in that ending. I think I keep going back to when we talked about 10 Cloverfield Lane and what you identified as the idolatry of safety. I would use The Witch to identify what I would call the idolatry of freedom. That we basically position freedom in our own minds and our own hearts as the capacity to do what we want when we want to and to have no restrictions or rules or boundaries upon our behavior or upon whatever we should choose to do at any given moment. And one of the things that I was thinking of is, part of his enticement. I make jokes anytime I'm talking about this film about, nasty goat butter. Because he just, says to Thomason, Black Phillip says to Thomason, do you like the taste of butter? And he asks her, do you want to live deliciously? And part of what it made me feel and think about is he's basically enticing her with the illusion of freedom, but really she will forever be a slave to different things, to different desires. Look at the fact that the witches evidently, either in ritualistic fashion or out of necessity, have to steal children, have to steal babies for whatever purpose that served. And it made me stop and recognize, and this is part of why I wanted so badly to sort of identify this and have a brief conversation about it, is it made me identify how we ourselves, whether we're looking at it on a personal level or looking at it on a national level, looking at it on a familial level, we have a tendency to just really need freedom above anything else. Like I just need to do what I want to do, and I need to not be beholden to anybody else, not be accountable to anybody else. I just want to have my needs, my desires be the utmost fulfillment in my life. And I think that it is important to be whole. I think it is important to have needs addressed, and I think that what's in our hearts and minds need to be given their proper place. But I think the pendulum can swing too far to where suddenly we are now quite literally slaves to our own desires or slaves to our own wishes. And that, in my understanding, is not freedom.
Well, and I think in the spirit of the Caleb and Thomason's fates being counterpoints to each other, I think right down the middle, you find the family's version of Christianity. I mean, like, I think the movie intends this. I think any sober reading of their version of faith is to recognize it as a broken one.
Yeah.
If broken on the far end, misguided on the softer end. And I think it's fascinating, you make a point of, slavery or bondage to one thing, forsaking bondage to one thing in favor of another. And, we address this. It might have been on The Witch. It might have been on Let Me In. Like you're gonna serve something.
Yeah.
And it is interesting. This is me overlaying interpretation onto the movie as opposed to what I think the movie might actually be saying. But, think about it from a counterpoint perspective. If you are into this sort of duality kind of view, Caleb, I think an honest reading of Caleb's experience in his death. Now, he does die, and so we can't ignore that fact, but is encountering what we would quote unquote term true Jesus. Like there is something true and real and beautiful happening to him. He is a child who has been abused in the worst way and is experiencing freedom from that experience. And unfortunately from this terrible life he was bound up in.
Right.
Whereas if the ending of the movie is literal, she as well is experiencing a literal encounter with the opposite end of that spectrum. Well, you made the point a minute ago of what is Thomason's future? Well, an encounter with, again, true Jesus, if you will, that doesn't result in death or isn't the result of a death.
Right.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. That is your guiding light. That is your principle. Loving your neighbor as yourself that's not too hard to not abuse. You know what I mean? Right. It's not too hard to twist that into a perverted way. Now, ignoring all the ways we could nuance that, but, what does loving your neighbor as yourself look like? Okay, we'll go do that. Now, juxtapose that with Black Phillip and what is going to happen to Thomason? Well, she is going to probably live in an enchanted hovel in the forest and steal children and bathe in their entrails and torment families to their demise. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
You've got a very clear kind of course of action that's going to take place on either end of this spectrum. And I just think that's sort of fascinating to consider, that I do think the movie is claiming that how these people view the world, how these people view their place in the world is a broken one.
Right.
And then it sets up these fascinating counterpoints that are worthy of, as we are doing now, a discussion.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, I think that, I didn't want to linger too long on this, just sort of as this is intended to be sort of a bonus supplemental. So maybe already, as brief as the conversation has been, with an eye towards winding down, I think we both expressed our thoughts pretty eloquently.
Cogently?
Yes. Cogent.
Cogently, eloquently, expertly, fantastically, eruditely.
All the adjectives were had. But I did have one additional scripture verse that I wanted to bring in, and that's simply Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 10. I feel like we quote Proverbs a lot, and I feel like that's a good thing. But Proverbs chapter 12 verse 10, it's the second half of that specific verse, and it made me recognize in this conversation of whether or not Thomason is really free and whether or not her ultimate position is a good one for her. You could look at it, particularly if you were of an anti-religious sentiment, you could look at that ending and say, well, now she's broken free because, Black Phillip set her free. And I'm going to get to the scripture verse in a second. But I think in almost every conversation that I've had about this, I took note that the only time, besides making Thomason sign his book, that Black Phillip directly interacts with any of the characters in a propulsive way to push the story forward is when he actually kills William. When William wakes up after having repented, who knows what William's next choices were going to be? Maybe to take them back to the plantation, maybe now to be penitent, maybe to completely change the direction of his life. And when he wakes up and sees the slaughter on his own home, then Black Phillip kills him. And I took note of that as significant and sizable. And then we get to this scripture verse because Black Phillip basically, allows Thomason to write her name in his book and then takes her out into the woods. She joins these witches. This is going to be the element of her life now. And what Proverbs chapter 12 verse 10 says is, even the kindest acts of the wicked are cruel. And it made me realize that you could look in some ways as if Black Phillip is doing her some degree of favor, that he's setting her free. But I walked away from that ending going, no, as a matter of fact, she's in the worst state she could have possibly been in. Like she's lost. She's ultimately irrevocably lost now at this point. And it made me want to just sort of reflect for a few moments, as we've done, on elements of freedom, on elements of sometimes we can consider, maybe, as we talked about in the Let Me In discussion, maybe this alternative option, because nothing else is meeting my needs, maybe this alternative option is the way to go, and recognizing that, no, that actually may be a crueler thing. That actually may be a worse thing to have yourself be aligned with, is to actually be ultimately irrevocably lost. So, did you have anything more that you wanted to add on that specific element?
Just resist goats in all forms in the future.
Resist the goats and they will flee.
Flee. Yes.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, we obviously this is a bonus supplemental episode, so we will sort of skip the usual. We skipped the fanfare at the top. We'll skip all the usual social media cues and just simply say we hope you've enjoyed this little addendum to the conversation. You know how to reach out to us. There's a variety of ways. Let us hear your thoughts on this ending, on this film in general, and we will be back.
And in true fashion, we have lived up to our motto, Reed, which is, the fear of God may be the beginning of wisdom, but it is not the end of the conversation in any form. And so here we are.
There you go. Thank you for keeping the tradition alive. I appreciate it.
Yes.
Well, thank you guys very much for listening. We hope you are having a good week, and we will see you next week with a proper full episode. You can check social media out to see what we're talking about next. And Nathan, thanks for having this little bonus conversation with me.
Sure thing.
See you guys next week. But the fear of God is only the beginning of wisdom. It is not the end of the conversation. And when it comes to this film, there is such a profound amount of things to talk about. Listeners, if you have thoughts on this film, things that we didn't touch on or that we didn't bring up that you'd like to mention or discuss, you can reach out to us in a variety of ways. You can reach out to us on Twitter. It's probably the easiest way. Nathan, what's our Twitter handle?
@TheFearOfGod.
You can also like us on Facebook. There's a link to that through Twitter. You can post there to us. You can follow me on Twitter @ReedLackey. Nathan, where can they find you on Twitter besides The Fear of God?
@TheNathanRouse.
You can also email us, fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. It's all one word, fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. You can also go to morethanonelesson.com, not only to find an additional conversation about The Witch, but to comment on this post. Leave us a review on iTunes. That would be greatly appreciated. But there's so much to discuss with this film, and I feel like we haven't even really scratched the surface. We've kind of saw the surface in the distance and said, there's a surface. But sincerely, reach out to us with your thoughts on this episode and on this movie. We thank you very, very much for listening. And Nathan, thank you so much for watching this film again and for having this conversation with me. I appreciate it.
Sure thing, as always.
All right, listeners, we will see you next week. Thanks so much again, and we'll talk to you then.